The sound of the coffee maker dripped in the silence of Margaret's modest kitchen, filling the room with the only warmth she had come to expect from her mornings. The sun filtered through the lace curtains, painting faint patterns on the countertop. 53 years old and living alone, Margaret had fallen into a rhythm that was both comforting and suffocating. Her days unfolded predictably: breakfast, a morning walk, a few hours of work at the library, and an evening spent curled up with a book or her knitting needles. The grocery store had become more than just a place to buy necessities. It was a chance to see the world outside her walls. She appreciated the familiar aisles and the chatter of strangers around her, even if she rarely joined in. It was there, in the produce section on a particularly dull Wednesday, that her predictable world shifted. Margaret reached for a ripe avocado just as another hand brushed hers. Startled, she glanced up and met a pair of warm, hazel eyes framed by a youthful, easy smile. "Oh, sorry about that," the young man said, his voice light with amusement. "Looks like we've got the same taste in avocados." She chuckled softly, feeling a bit awkward. "No problem. It's the best one here." He held up the avocado in question. "Then I guess I owe you this one." Margaret hesitated but shook her head. No, you go ahead. I'll find another." "Nonsense," he replied, setting it into her basket. "I insist." Her smile lingered longer than she intended as she watched him walk away, his confident stride radiating a charm she hadn't expected. It was a fleeting moment, a chance encounter, but something about it stayed with her as she wandered the rest of the aisles. Back home, unpacking the groceries, she realized she had been smiling. She scolded herself for the fluttering in her chest. What was she even thinking? It was nothing, just a small interaction. Yet, her predictable day felt a little brighter. For the first time in a long time, she found herself looking forward to her next visit to the store. The next Wednesday, Margaret returned to the grocery store, her heart carrying an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. She felt silly. It wasn't as if she expected to see him again. But life had become so predictable that even the smallest spark felt monumental. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of humor. As she rounded the corner near the bakery, there he was, inspecting a shelf of coffee beans. He looked up and recognized her instantly. A smile spread across his face, warm and easy, like they were old friends. "Avocado lady," he greeted playfully. "Back for round 2? Margaret laughed, the sound surprising even herself. "You caught me, though I'm steering clear of the produce section this time." "Well, then it's safe to assume I won't be stealing anything from your basket today." He extended his hand. "I'm Ethan, by the way." "Margaret," she replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm but kind, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered when she last felt this kind of attention. Their conversation started simply, small talk about coffee brands and weather, but it stretched, lingering longer than she expected. By the time she left the store, her cart fuller than planned, she realized she had been smiling the entire drive home. Their meetings became less coincidental over the following weeks. Ethan would appear when she least expected it, sometimes near the bakery, other times in the dairy aisle. They began to linger after their chats, walking out together and exchanging light jokes or stories about their lives. He shared that he was 35, a freelance graphic designer who worked odd hours, which explained his weekday shopping trips. She told him about her work at the library, her passion for books, and her quiet life. One afternoon, as they parted ways in the parking lot, he said something that left her heart skittering. "You make this whole grocery trip feel a little less like a chore, Margaret." That night, as she brewed her tea, she thought about his words. She thought about the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, how he listened so intently, making her feel like the most interesting person in the world. It was a small, unassuming connection, but it had begun to color her days in a way she hadn't realized she craved. And with that realization came a small flicker of hope, both exhilarating and terrifying. It was a breezy afternoon when Margaret found herself at the park, seated on a weathered bench with a paperback novel resting unread in her lap. Ethan had suggested they meet outside the grocery store for a change, and though the idea seemed casual enough, it left her inexplicably nervous. She spotted him approaching, a coffee cup in each hand and a confident ease in his stride. He wore a dark blue jacket that matched his eyes, his tousled hair catching the sunlight. As he handed her a cup, their fingers brushed briefly, and Margaret felt a jolt that lingered longer than it should have. "Thought you might need a caffeine boost," Ethan said, settling beside her. "You seem like a latte kind of person." She chuckled, taking a sip. "You guessed right. And you seem like someone who can't start their day without coffee." "Guilty as charged," he replied with a grin. The hours slipped by as they talked about everything and nothing. Margaret found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years, recounting stories of her late husband, her daughter who lived states away, and the small joys she found in her quiet life. Ethan listened, his expressions thoughtful, his questions gentle and sincere. When the conversation shifted to him, he shared stories of his own, his love of photography, his attempts at cooking that often ended in disaster, and his dreams of traveling to places he'd only seen in movies. At one point, he turned to her with an earnest look. "You're easy to talk to, Margaret. It's rare to find someone who listens like you do." Her heart fluttered at his words. She brushed it off as simple flattery, but the warmth in her chest betrayed her. This wasn't just friendly banter anymore. It felt different, intimate, almost electric. Later that night, as she sat alone in her living room, the feeling she'd been avoiding crept in with startling clarity. She liked Ethan. More than she should. More than she expected. The realization hit her like a wave, knocking the air from her lungs. How could she, 53 years old, a widow, a woman whose life had been defined by predictability, find herself drawn to a man almost 2 decades younger? The rational part of her insisted it was just a passing fancy, born out of loneliness and the novelty of his attention. But deep down, she knew it was more. And that knowledge terrified her. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions Margaret had no idea how to navigate. She oscillated between exhilaration and dread, between the quiet thrill of seeing Ethan and the nagging voice in her mind telling her this was wrong, or at the very least impossible. In the quiet hours of the night, when the house was still and her thoughts had no competition, her doubts grew loudest. What would people say if they knew? Her friends from book club? Her neighbors? She could hear the whispers already. The murmurs about a woman's old enough to know better. But there was another voice too, softer yet insistent. It reminded her of the way Ethan looked at her when she spoke, as though every word she said mattered. It reminded her of how his laughter had the power to fill the hollow spaces she didn't realize had grown so vast. One Saturday, she bumped into him at the grocery store again. Their chance meetings had become more deliberate now, but neither of them acknowledged it aloud. As they walked through the aisles, her heart beat just a little faster with every step. "I was thinking," Ethan said, glancing at her with a smile. "You should come with me to the art exhibit downtown next week. There's this incredible photographer showcasing his work. I think you'd love it." The invitation caught her off guard. It wasn't that she didn't want to go. She did desperately, but the thought of them being seen together in such a public setting made her stomach twist. "Oh, I don't know," she said hesitantly. "It's been a while since I've been to anything like that." "All the more reason to go," he said, his tone light but persuasive. "You deserve a little adventure, Margaret." Adventure. The word lingered in her mind long after she returned home. When was the last time she'd had one? For years, her life had been about quiet stability, about avoiding risks, about keeping her head down and her heart safe. That night, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection. The lines on her face told stories of a life well lived, but they also whispered of time slipping by. Why couldn't she have this? Why couldn't she let herself feel joy, feel alive? Even if it didn't fit the mold of what others deemed appropriate. But with the hope came fear. The kind that settled in her chest and refused to leave. What if she was reading too much into this? What if Ethan's kindness was just that, kindness? And yet, as she closed her eyes to sleep, one thought rang louder than the rest. Even if this was fleeting, even if it ended in heartbreak, wasn't it worth the risk to feel something real again? The decision crept up on her slowly, like the morning light stretching across her kitchen floor. Margaret wasn't impulsive by nature. Every choice she made was deliberate, weighed, and measured. But with Ethan, her carefully maintained rules seemed to blur, shifting into something unrecognizable. It happened on a Thursday evening, when the weight of her thoughts pressed too heavily against her chest. She was in the garden, trimming the lavender bushes she kept as much for their fragrance as for the sense of calm they brought her. Her phone rested on the table nearby, Ethan's last message still glowing on the screen. Hope you're having a good day. Let me know if you like company for that coffee we keep talking about." She stared at the words, her hands trembling slightly as she clipped the final stem. A voice inside her whispered, "Say yes." Another argued, "He's just being polite. He can't possibly mean it the way you think he does." Before she could overthink herself into oblivion, she grabbed her phone and typed back a response. "Actually, I've been meaning to fix a light in my kitchen. Do you happen to be handy with tools?" She hit send before she could change her mind, her heart hammering in her chest. It was a thinly veiled excuse, and she wasn't proud of it, but it felt safer than admitting she just wanted to spend time with him. His reply came almost immediately. "I'm no expert, but I can give it a shot. What time works for you?" And just like that, the plan was set. He would come over Saturday afternoon. As the day approached, Margaret found herself alternating between anticipation and outright panic. She cleaned the house meticulously, as though every corner needed to reflect some version of herself she wasn't entirely sure existed. She changed her outfit 3 times before settling on a simple blouse and jeans, casual, approachable, but not without thought. When Saturday arrived, the sound of the doorbell sent her heart into her throat. She opened the door to find Ethan standing there, a small toolkit in hand and that easy smile that made her breath catch. "This is a place, huh?" he said, stepping inside and glancing around. "Feels like you've lived here forever." "I have," she admitted, closing the door behind him. "Too long, probably." "Well," he said, setting his tools on the counter, "let's see if we can't give this old kitchen a little TLC." Watching him work, Margaret felt a quiet warmth settle over her. He wasn't perfect. He fumbled with the screwdriver more than once and cursed under his breath when the fixture refused to budge, but he was there. Present. Engaged. When the task was finally done, they sat at the kitchen table with mugs of tea. The air between them felt charged, as though the small act of him being in her home had shifted something fundamental. "I hope I didn't inconvenience you," she said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "Margaret," he said, meeting her gaze, "there's nowhere else I'd rather be right now." The sincerity in his voice undid her. For a moment, she didn't care about the age difference, or the whisper she imagined in the back of her mind. All she felt was the warmth of his presence, and the way he made her world a little less lonely. The afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting long, gentle shadows across the kitchen. They had moved from the table to the couch, where the conversation had ebbed into a comfortable silence, the kind that spoke more than words ever could. Margaret found herself watching Ethan, his eyes thoughtful as he sipped his tea, the edges of his smile soft and quiet. She had always been cautious about intimacy. It wasn't that she didn't yearn for it. She had loved deeply in her youth, had been married, had felt the sharp pang of loss when her husband passed away years ago. But time, with its slow and steady march, had taught her to guard herself. People, like moments, came and went, and nothing could be trusted to stay. Not even love. But Ethan, there was something about him that made the world feel just a little more forgiving. His easy manner, the way he listened without judgment, the way he seemed to be waiting for her to take the next step, but never pushing. She had spent so much time in her life learning how to be alone, learning how to fill the space around her with books, plants, and routines. But now, with him here in her space, she was finally aware of how much emptiness those things could never quite fill. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. She hadn't meant to ask it, but it felt like the right question to break the silence that stretched between them. Ethan looked at her, his eyes full of an understanding she hadn't expected. He set his cup down, his fingers lingering on the rim, as if trying to choose his words carefully. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low and honest. "I think everyone does in one way or another. But it's funny," he continued, his gaze shifting to the window as if looking for something beyond the glass. "Sometimes it's not even about being physically alone. It's more about the quiet, the space that fills up when no one else is there. It can feel like too much sometimes, you know?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes," she thought. "I know exactly what you mean." They both fell into silence again, but it was different this time. There was no rush to fill it, no awkwardness. The connection between them, slow and subtle as it had been, seemed to fill the room with an unspoken understanding. Her heart quickened, and she could feel the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself beginning to crack. The vulnerability she had been avoiding for so long was there, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to break free. And yet, the fear still clung to her. The fear of the consequences, of what people would say, of what it would mean for her to invite him in, not just physically but emotionally. She had never allowed herself to get so close to someone again. She had never allowed herself the possibility of more, not since her husband died. But Ethan, his presence was like a magnet, pulling her in, forcing her to confront what she had buried for so long. He wasn't pushing her, wasn't demanding anything. He was simply here, just as he had been in that grocery store aisle all those weeks ago. The words tumbled out of her before she could stop them. "I've been thinking about what you said, about wanting to be here." He looked at her with that same steady gaze, the one that always seemed to see right through her defenses. "I meant it," he said simply. The heat rose in her cheeks, her pulse racing in a way that had nothing to do with the moment itself, and everything to do with the shift happening inside her. For the first time in years, she wanted to believe, to trust that this connection wasn't fleeting, that it wasn't a mistake. That love, real, raw, complicated love, was still something she could have. And then, without overthinking it, Margaret reached for his hand. The contact was soft at first, tentative, like a whisper against the tension between them. But when he squeezed her hand in return, she felt a surge of warmth shoot through her, spreading from her fingertips to her chest. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the beginning of something that could change everything. Later that evening, after Ethan had left, Margaret sat in the quiet of her living room, staring out the window at the fading light. The conversation they'd shared still lingered in the air, like a soft hum that wouldn't quite fade away. She had never been the type to dwell on what-ifs, but tonight, something felt different. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath her, and she was standing on a new terrain, one that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She couldn't stop thinking about the connection they had shared. It wasn't just physical, although there had been moments where the chemistry between them had been undeniable. It was deeper than that, richer. It was the way his voice had softened when he spoke to her, as though he was giving her space to breathe in the silence. The way his eyes held a mixture of admiration and understanding that felt like a balm to her weary soul. But more than anything, it was the way he had made her feel alive. For so long, her life had been shaped by the quiet, predictable rhythms of solitude. She had filled her days with books, with plants, with little tasks that kept her mind engaged. But now, she could feel the stirrings of something she had buried deep within her heart, something that had long been dormant. It was hope. She had spent so many years convincing herself that love was a luxury for the young, for those whose lives had not yet been marked by loss or time. But sitting there in the stillness of the evening, she realized how wrong she had been. Love was not bound by age or circumstance. It wasn't confined to the early years of life, nor was it a privilege that only the youthful deserved. Love, in all its complexity, was something that could happen at any stage of life. Even for someone like her. Margaret had spent so much time thinking about what it meant to grow older. Society had its own narrative about aging, one that made women feel invisible or irrelevant once they passed a certain age. But sitting with the warmth of Ethan's presence still on her skin, she knew in her heart that there was nothing about her that needed to be hidden away or forgotten. She was still whole, still capable of passion, of desire, of love. Her fingers brushed the edges of the fabric of the couch where they had sat together, and she smiled softly. She had spent too many years thinking that she had missed her chance. But now, she saw things differently. The world wasn't over for her. The world wasn't over for any of us, really. It had taken her so long to realize this, but in a way it was a gift. It was a gift that Ethan had given her, his tenderness, his patience, and most of all, his belief that love could still be something real, even in the later chapters of life. She thought about the future, about what might come next. It wasn't certain. She wasn't naive enough to believe that love, especially one as unconventional as this, would be without challenges. There would be whispers. There would be judgment. People would talk. But for the first time in so many years, Margaret found herself not caring as much about what others thought. What mattered now was this moment, and the feeling that had bloomed in her chest like a long-forgotten flower. What mattered was that she was no longer afraid. Her mind wandered back to Ethan. She could still feel the pressure of his hand in hers, the way he had held her gaze with such sincerity. She could feel his presence still, like a quiet echo in the room. And in that moment, she knew she would see him again. Maybe not tomorrow or the next day, but she would find her way back to him, and to this connection that was slowly changing her life. Love, Margaret had come to understand, was not bound by rules or expectations. It was something that could be found when least expected, and she would never again apologize for wanting it. Margaret stood in front of the mirror the next morning, brushing her hair with a gentle, thoughtful touch. The quiet of the house seemed almost sacred now, a sharp contrast to the whirlwind of thoughts that had occupied her mind since Ethan had left the night before. She felt different, lighter, somehow, as though a weight she hadn't even realized she carried had been lifted. She looked at herself, really looked at herself for the first time in ages. It wasn't vanity, not exactly. It was more an understanding. She had spent so many years worried about how the world saw her, about whether the lines on her face, the graying strands in her hair, made her invisible. But she had been wrong. She hadn't disappeared. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to awaken. And in that moment, standing in the mirror, she realized that it had arrived. Ethan had shown her that love didn't care about age, about time. Love didn't wait for permission, didn't need to be wrapped in the approval of others. It simply was. It was in the soft glances, the shared silences, the quiet understanding that bloomed between two people who had no reason to expect anything, but still found something real. As Margaret stepped away from the mirror, she allowed herself to feel proud of the woman she was, of the woman she had become. There were still challenges ahead, undoubtedly, but the woman in the mirror was resilient, capable of living fully, of feeling deeply. She had embraced this unexpected connection, and she had no intention of letting it go. Love had come to her in an unlikely form, but it had come, and it was beautiful in all its imperfections. She made her way to the kitchen and, without hesitation, picked up the phone. The sound of the dial tone seemed almost like an invitation to something new. When the call was answered, her voice was steady, but her heart was a little faster than usual. "Hi, Ethan," she said softly, her words filled with the warmth she felt inside. "I was thinking about you." There was a pause, and then his voice, warm and familiar, filled the space between them. "I've been thinking about you too," he replied. Margaret smiled to herself, a sense of peace settling within her. She had learned that love was not just a fleeting moment or a youthful indulgence. It was a choice to embrace what was real, to follow your heart, no matter the age or the distance between expectations and reality. And for the first time in years, Margaret was ready to live fully, to love fully, and to never apologize for it. Love was for her. Love was for anyone who dared to believe. And in that belief, there was power to break down barriers, to challenge societal norms, and to live a life without regrets. And so, as Margaret prepared for whatever might come next, she did so with an open heart, ready to embrace the unexpected, to cherish the connection she had found, and to honor the love that had blossomed in the quiet spaces of her life. Because she knew now that love, at any age, was a force to be reckoned with, and she would never again take it for granted.